So there is a saying among CGI artists, before you can affect it, you have to select it. And that saying is basically an illustration of how important the selection tools are in Photoshop. Now we're going to go through the three different kinds of selection tools here and how they work, how you can use them. Even if you're familiar with some of the selection tools, it's still worth going through this video because I'm pretty sure you're going to find some things that you didn't already know, because that still happens to me when I go watch videos about selection tools. So what selection tools do is they basically isolate a part of your image so that anything that you do can only affect the parts of your image that are inside that selection. There's three different kinds of selection tools. They're the second, third, and fourth tools up here in your toolbar. The first one is the shape selection tools. So there's different shapes, rectangle, ellipse, etc. There are the drawing selection tools, and then there are the smart selection tools. And we're going to take a look at all three of them. So to start with, we're just going to take the rectangular selection tool and make a selection here. If I then grab a paintbrush and try to paint, you can see that the painting only affects inside the selection. I'm not able to affect anything that is outside. So that's what selections do. They limit what you're doing to the area that you have selected. Now sometimes this can cause problems because you can accidentally make a little tiny selection somewhere off that you didn't mean. Sometimes it can even wind up off of the canvas. You can't even see it. And then you're going down here trying to paint and nothing's happening, and you call me over because you can't figure out why nothing is happening. And the first thing that I'll suggest that you do is hit Control D, which is the shortcut for deselect, and then suddenly you can paint. So there was a little selection hidden somewhere that you couldn't see it, and that's what was keeping you from doing anything on your image. So that's a handy tip right there. If ever things are not working the way that you think they should, try Control D to deselect and see if that fixes it. Okay, a few other things about selection tools. These are things that all three types have in common. First of all, there is a handy shortcut. When you are drawing out a selection, if you hold down the space bar, suddenly instead of making, I haven't let go of the mouse, but instead of making the square bigger, I'm now able to move it around. And then I let go of the space bar, I can continue to make it bigger and smaller. So that space bar trick is very handy if you're trying to select exactly the right spot. A few other things you can do. If you go up to the top of the toolbar here, you'll see some icons. If you hover over them for a few seconds, it will tell you what they are. There is an add to selection, a subtract from selection, and intersect, which we're not going to worry too much about. The default is new selection. So if I have this selection here and then I go make another one, the first one disappears. And that's the easiest way to get rid of a selection, by the way, is just to click off somewhere else. That gets rid of it too, if you don't want to deselect. But you can, by clicking these buttons, change how new selections work. So if I click the add, now when you can see the little plus sign on the cursor there, so you know you're in add mode. If I now draw another box, that box gets added to the selection, and I can keep doing that as much as I want to add new elements to the selection. Now, there's also a subtract mode, and that is just the opposite. Whatever I select disappears from the selection. And that can be handy if you accidentally select too much. You can subtract things from the selection, or if you want a hole in the middle, you can subtract things from the selection. So those options are there anytime you need them for adding and subtracting. And the cursor will tell you if you're in that mode. Another thing you can do is with the cursor inside your selection, you right click. There's also the option there to deselect if you forget the shortcut. But you can go down to what is called select inverse. And what select inverse does is basically flip your selection. So right now, let me just go to the paintbrush tool again. Right now, we have this area selected. So when I paint, that's what gets filled in. But you can, you have to be on a selection tool, right click inside, go to select inverse. Now I can only paint outside the selection. So it just flips what you have selected. So that can be very useful. You may not see obviously why now, but you will when we start getting into our tutorials this week. Okay, so I'm going to undo that. All right, so what's a practical use of those tools? One thing that you can do, I'm just going to Control D to deselect. Let's say that you wanted to put a black frame around this image. So what you could do is make sure that you are on the Add Selection button up here, and you could kind of draw out thin little boxes around the edge, and then make that into a frame. How do you make that into the frame? You right-click inside, and then go to Fill, and then you can just fill it with black. There's other options, there's whites, there's gray, but if you fill it with black, boom, you've got a nice border. And then Control D to deselect. Now, the problem with that is that it's not perfectly even because I didn't get the boxes exactly the same. So what would be a more effective way, Control Z to back up here, Control D to deselect, what might be a more effective way to do it is to draw out a box, hold down space so that you can move it and make sure it looks exactly centered. Then you can either right click or go to select inverse, then right click inside and go to fill black. Control D to deselect, and there you go. Another thing that just to be aware of is that if you hold shift, just like with shapes, if you hold shift, you'll get a perfect square or a perfect circle when you do this. And the last thing we're going to talk about that applies to all selections is something that you might remember from our Introduction to Photoshop tutorial. Let me just switch to the elliptical tool. I'm going to make a circle here. So I'm holding down shift so that I get a perfect circle. And then if you go up to the select, so all of your selection options can be found here. Many, but not all of them, can also be found if you right click inside the selection. But we're going to go to modify and then to feather. And we're going to put a feathering effect around here, and I'm going to put a high one of about 50. Feathering means instead of having a very clear, sharp edge, it has a faded edge. Make a new layer, and a selection can affect any layer. If I select layer 1 and paint in here, I'll only be able to paint inside the selection. If I go to layer 2 and paint in there, same thing. I can only do it inside the selection. So what I'm going to do is fill this. I'll right click inside and fill it with black so you can see what it looks like. So you see how it's a much more faded edge. If I Control D, it's a very, very faded, soft edge. Now, when would you want to use that? Well, you may not have a whole lot of opportunities to put a faded circle in the middle of something like that, but if we undo back to our selection and not fill it, and we invert it instead, so let's go to select and inverse. So now we're selecting everything outside the circle. Now if we have to be on a selection tool to right click inside. So go to selection tool, right click inside and put fill and fill it with black. Now what we can do is use this to highlight a particular area. Let's say that this was a document with, I don't know, a screenshot, and we'll put that layer on top. And let's say we wanted to emphasize the fact that it was a free thing. So we put this around there, and we take layer 2, and we just reduce the opacity a little bit so that you can still see the rest of the web page, but your attention clearly is directed to this particular spot. It creates a spotlight effect. So that's a practical use of feathering a simple shape. So I think that's enough for you to get the idea of how to use these simple shapes. We're going to move on now to the drawing selection tools.